Welcome everyone. We are, Rod and I rehearsed this a couple weeks ago up in Forks, and we had this crazy idea that we were going to do these all around Western Washington, the planning area, and realized our sanity was probably fairly important. So we decided to try to do a webinar. So welcome everyone. If you're logged on, welcome. This is the first time I've done a webinar in this venue. Actually, first time doing a webinar, period. I do not have the ability to see who's logged on. So as we get to the question and answer sessions, I sent an email a little bit ago that should have an agenda attached. When we get to that part, you should all have my cell phone number in the email I sent with the logon information. If you want to, you can text me in some questions as we go. So with that, we'll get started. So first off, just quick introductions. I'm Matt Comiskey with American Forest Resource Council. And then we also have Rod Fleck with the City of Forks starting out here first on the agenda, and then Heath Heikkila with AFRC kind of following up. And then in the agenda, we'll have kind of a question and answer after each presentation and kind of a wrap up. So Rod, off to you.
Well, good afternoon, and thanks for being here in person, and thanks for those who are online. My name's Rod Fleck. I'm the city attorney and planner in Forks, and I always do this slide just to give folks an idea of where I'm from. I'm out on the Olympic Peninsula on the far west part of the Olympic Peninsula, and natural resources is a big part of our economic base in spite of losing the mills that we've lost 3 years ago. So it's still a big part of our economic base. And that's one of the reasons my government is really engaged in DNR policy issues. I've been that case since I've been there for 24 years, but my history with DNR issues actually goes back about 25, 26 years. Forks sits in a place called the Olympic Experimental State Forest. You'll hear me make a reference to the OESF. That's what I'm referring to. It's this area on the west, which also coincides with what we call the West End. It's an area that's both federal and state designated, and it's supposed to be this laboratory for undertaking different approaches to natural resource, timber management, and local economic opportunity. And it has its own landscape plan, and I'm going to be zeroing in on a section right there. I don't know if my cursor is showing, but as we talk about this, Clallam Bay is up where the cursor is pointing at, and you're going to hear me talk a bit about the Clallam Bay block. We're here to talk about the long-term marbled murrelet, the long-term conservation strategy for the marbled murrelet. This is a requirement that comes out of the 1997 Habitat Conservation Plan. It is 2018, so you might be asking why now? Well, it's been 21 years in the making, and DNR has been working through this effort for the last decade at a different pace, and now trying to bring that to completion. The murrelet is that little bird right there. The murrelet has a unique, it spends about 95% of its time out in salt water, flies in to lay an egg on a mossy branch that's called a platform, and you can see one of those on the left of that set of pictures. I'm using DNR's document as an example of this, and it likes what we would say large trees, old growth type trees and stand. The area that this conservation strategy is going to cover is predominantly Western Washington, almost all of Western Washington. You can see that red line, and it's a distance of, I'm going to say 60 miles. I think it's 55 miles. I just round up to 60 miles from salt water. And that's because that's where it will go to that nesting stage. Again, I'm using nesting in air quotes because it doesn't build a nest. It has a site loyalty to certain stands or trees, the bird does, and part of its reproduction process. One of the things I want to kind of make real clear at the beginning is that all of the conservation strategies that are proposed by DNR HQ are going, except for alternative B, are going to add additional acres for conservation purposes. It was interesting, and you'll see a little note that says, "Sir," there was an exchange with an elected official who said, "Oh, well, it's going to release up tens of thousands of acres, and it's actually going to be less than what is currently in the interim, the interim strategy that's going to be conserved. And so my little note was, sir, could you look at the chart here from DNR's RDIS and tell me how those numbers are less than Alt A, except for Alternative B? And what is going on is that the DNR has certain lands on hold right now, depending on which conservation strategy they go with. Different lands might be released that are on hold for the conservation strategy they select. But at the bottom, at the end of the day, there are going to be more acres in conservation status than they are currently under what Alternative A, the no action interim, in theory, their interim strategy. I'm going to focus on Alternative H in the revised draft environmental impact statement. Alternative H came out as the preferred alternative. And so that's what I'm really going to look at. And with Alternative H, what's fascinating is it comes up with this idea of these strategic areas. It was a new concept introduced into the RDIS that then relied upon another concept in the DEIS that came out about a year ago of special habitat areas, SHAs. And special habitat areas were these areas on the map that were going to provide a habitat area for the murrelet, had certain qualifications and needs, and in theory was going to be of great benefit to the bird now or somewhere in the course of the roughly 50 years up to 80 years of this conservation strategy. It's 49 years, I get that, but I round numbers up. The Board of Natural Resources has not adopted this strategy. They laid out a rough framework is the best way I'm going to describe this at a retreat and a subsequent meeting in November. But if you actually try to go and see where the board voted on what the strategy was going to be, you're going to be as bald as I am, pulling your hair out, because you won't find this is the date, this is the vote, and these are the elements. You'll find these are the concepts. So I refer to this as DNR's headquarters, HQ's preferred alternative, the department's preferred alternative. They're going to take it back to the board. The three strategic areas are delineated on maps. They encompass a group of SHAs in them. They are very well defined by geographic units, and that's going to be an issue as we talk about the Clown Bay block. Now, the Clown Bay, this is the Alternative H with all lands in Clown Bay and how those are impacted. We have a GIS contractor that we bring in, and they ran this through DNR's information that we obtained from a Public Records Act request. And again, I'm going to focus on this area right here. That's the area of the Clown Bay block. And to help a little bit more, it falls in the Clown Bay planning unit in the OESF. This area here is what we're talking about. This green, as you can see by trust, that is county, what we used to call Forest Board transfer lands, state forest lands, county trust lands. I'm going to say county trust lands because it's a vernacular that most folks know. But you will see the Clown Bay block is almost all county trust lands, except for these two little patches in that odd green, or maybe three patches because there's an otter green here too. I want you now to go with me, and we're going to look at that block from an aerial perspective, because we're talking about murrelets, and we're talking about a bird that likes large trees and large platforms that are moss covered. That's essential to its reproductive and raising of young and its survival. And I will just say, spoiler, some things don't match up. This is the area of the Clown Bay block. You will see up in there, Clown Bay is marked with the little red arrow, Google Earth map. This is from about 2 years ago, if I remember right, the image. And right there is the Clown Bay Prison in the middle of the Clown Bay block. And you can get a sense of that is a patchwork of landscapes, including areas that have been recently harvested just lost the word, VARH, variable retention, variable harvest. We'd say clear cut in the West End, but that's the VRHs, and then various thinnings and different approaches. So that's in the Clown Bay block. Now, I'm going to, because you may not know where the lines are of the block, we're going to start moving to maps that are going to show you the current long-term cover, forest cover that's associated with that block under current rules, mainly riparian. But I'm going to put a caveat. When you see the riparian lines, in the OESF, we have a different riparian strategy that can be applied under the Habitat Conservation Plan that allows for activities within riparian areas. So while you'll see this, then that's kind of the exception. I live in an area that's the exception to the HCP. So when you see Matt's maps of this, that exception doesn't apply to most of Matt's maps when he gives you other examples. This is that block with those areas. And then you can see in the map what I call the kid on the couch with his feet up, not to pick on my son. And you can even see an eye there, I think, in one version of these maps, looking at or throwing his Xbox controller across the room. Okay, so this is the Xbox controller, and you'll see this purple reddish line. That's one of those special habitat areas. And you'll see long-term forest cover, that's the current rule. And then the blue is occupied sites and buffers. All the alternatives say we are going to protect the occupied sites and buffers. And what I find fascinating on this map is this one right here. And I got a couple who are foresters in the room. That's an occupied site and buffer. The bird has a site fidelity, meaning that they go to the same site. Now, assuming the bird is doing that, you'll notice, I don't know, is it not showing? Okay, in the middle of this map, and we're going to do this descriptive, in the middle of the map, you'll see a blue dot that's surrounded by, or closely accompanied by, a set of clear cuts to the north. Okay, site fidelity, just as an FYI, there is a note in the science report that there could be some sites that are not in the best interest of the bird, in that they'll keep going back there, but their productivity at that site may be compromised for a whole host of reasons. Whether or not this is one of those sites is a good question, and we're an experimental state forest, so I would argue that this might be one where I'll say collectively, environmental, beneficiary, DNR, we should understand that site. Because if it is productive, producing little baby murrelets, that's a good set of questions. And if it's not, and it's not, what's going on there? But these other two sites, the one to the far west, you'll see, that is area that has occupied stands. It's got riparian areas. When you see, if we go back one and you just kind of look at that corner, you'll see the area in question, and it's pretty much dominated by stands that look from the air to be an older forest cover. But we don't rely on that. In the system that we're using, we use a thing called P-stage, and it's the probability of murrelets to occupy the stand. It's based upon various forest attributes. Matt gets to talk about that because that's not my area. But what we do have is we have maps that show us where P-stage is by type. And in the OESF, the proposal in alternative H is that P-stage 25 or greater would be part of these sustainable harvest areas. And if you're looking at this map, P-stage 25 is orange, and then the other colors above that increase with the probability of the bird to use that site based upon its characteristics. And you'll notice something really odd about the kid on the couch. His high top tennis shoes are all white, probably white Adidas. We're using my analogy, and they're not P-stage at all, yet they're included in this. And if you go back, you'll also notice the kid on the couch, some interesting things that they've included a set of clear cuts in this special habitat area. And in the RDIS, there is a note and caveat, I think it's in chapter 4 with regard to the murrelet, that they understand that there may be sections that they've just added, but even at the end of the 50 years or the 80 years, probably won't even make P-stage 25. This is the application of that P-stage long-term forest cover in this special habitat area on the Clown Bay block. There's about 16,000 acres in this block. From what we can calculate, it's around 28% that's locked up. So I just conservatively said at least 25%. I'm used to playing the your numbers wrong game, Rod, with DNR HQ, you're off by a percentage point. And I usually respond, that doesn't help your argument. It sounds nice, but you know, attacking the difference in the number really doesn't undermine the concept at play here. Now, one thing about the SHAs is that there was this perception that there could be some activity done in the SHAs, and it's worded oddly in the RDIS. However, at the Raymond solution table about 3 weeks ago, a question was asked by DNR HQ staff as to, well, we could go in and we could take activities within these areas and manipulate the stands and pull out and do thinning, and we can pull out value, and that'll be great for the bird and for the communities. And it was made pretty clear that's not an option. It's not really even likely that that's an option. And when you look at the way things are worded, any activities in these areas may also require Fish and Wildlife concurrence. So in effect, the argument a group of us have been making that the SHAs are pretty much a no-touch, off-base designation appears right now to be valid based upon the terms and understanding of the document, and also some of the terms and shared elsewhere. HQ is going to go look into that, figured that might need to be renegotiated, some negotiations, and looked into that. I don't know the status of those meetings. I've not heard whether they've had those. And now I want to look at the impacts. So that's the forest. Okay, that's the area off base, and you can also see areas that have already been harvested. So it's going to be 40 years before revenues are realized in that area. Now I want to talk about the impacts. And I'm going to use the Clallam County Treasurer's Report, and I want to point out that we're talking about the Aqua area as the junior taxing district there. That's Clallam Bay's junior taxing district in Clallam County. Taxing districts don't radically change. There's a mythology in HQ that I'm here to tell you is just flat out wrong. We don't change taxing districts. As attorneys, we try to use, when we create a new taxing district, like a park and rec district, we'll say the boundaries of the Quigley Valley School District. That way we don't have to recreate a legal description. Okay, there's a reason you don't want to do that, because it takes a lot of time, effort, and money. So in many rural communities, our taxing districts have been this way. This is a digitization of a map that is hand-colored and penciled from about 1942. Okay, so that taxing district up there hasn't changed, and it's Fire District 5. Fire District 5 is the smallest of the junior taxing districts in that district. So there's a layer of taxing districts: fire districts, hospital, fire district, school, hospital, library, port, county roads, county operations, state schools, in about that order, than state general, with the latter being the top of that, the more senior of the districts. Now, Fire District 5, from the Clallam Bay block, that's predominantly its source of income, along with property taxes, has on average made about $50,000 a year when you look over this period of time. And what has a group of us extremely concerned is that the proposal under Alternative H is going to have a long-term reduction in those revenues. Now, just to show you, to bring this forward, Fire District 5 in 2017 had an increase in revenue, and you saw this kind of up, down in their revenue depending on the size and nature of the sales in the district, $120,000. And then to date, when this was pulled, they're making $7,000, which is way lower than any of their earlier periods of time. And we are arguing that there's a reason for that. That because of the way things are locked up on the land base, that is currently preventing sales from being laid out. Once this is adopted, the belief that an argument I'm putting forward is that Fire District 5 is probably going to have a revenue stream somewhere in the $20,000–$25,000 range. But there's a couple other things that bother me about the DNR RDIS. Because it is a NEPA-related document, it has to do NEPA and SEPA. And one of the things it has to do under NEPA is address economic justice, social economic impact. If I don't understand forestry, I can tell you I understand demography. Okay, that's kind of the world in which I get to operate. And I would argue DNR didn't do it right. And they did little to no required economic justice analysis. Their social economic impact on the strategic areas, which are those 3 delineated geographic areas, and the special habitat areas on junior taxing districts from the preferred alternative aren't discussed. They talk about how it's difficult to understand and do the analysis because Those are small data sets, and they're going to rely on these other documents. So I'm going to show you some problems with their reliance on this other document. And they did this countywide analysis. Here it is. I'm showing two parts of it. The first part I'm showing just because for years, Phil Kitchell, who used to be a county commissioner, and I, who were doing a lot of this work, we're getting ourselves kind of beat up when every time we use these multiplier numbers for jobs for volume. And then DNR quoted the same paper. So I just kind of feel that Kitchell has vindicated. This is his, effort to show that. They then did this analysis. They relied upon a report from 2004, the Daniels report, and unemployment numbers for county-wide, and then decide that in economic diversity, and said, well, here's the resiliency of these counties. And Clallam County is somewhat resilient, resilient, dependent upon natural resources, but resilient. And they relied it on Daniels. And I'm familiar with Daniels' report. It's from 2004, so it was relying on Census 2000 data. And it's 2018, so two of my children weren't born when the data set was being collected for this. And things might have changed in Western Clallam County since 2000, just a thought. And it noted here that the Clallam County had a forest dependency that's medium, and I think that's still valid, even though we've lost a set of mills. And the social economic resiliency rating for Clallam County is medium. But Daniels has a huge caveat, and DNR quoted the report, relied on the data, and didn't read the damn caveat. Because the caveat says, be careful, because you could average out the county's data, and in doing so, you will hide or overlook impacts at a smaller scale level. It's the averaging over line that can mask severe distress in one community when it's offset by prosperity in another. Okay? So, thinking, well, okay, that's fine. Maybe we could see how they dealt with environmental justice, and that's a federal requirement under executive order. There is a guidebook that's found on the World Wide Web, as it notes in this, from 1997 that says how this could be done. And it really is supposed to look at the impacts of the decision on low-income communities and communities of color. That's the whole purpose of this section. And it gives guidelines. Even tells you to go use census data that comes out on an annual basis that you can find. The reason I said the World Wide Webs, it's quoted there. I love 1997. Okay. And DNR didn't do this. They argued that it was too difficult to find the data, too difficult to get the information. As an aside, I took one of the slides out. This is the short set. One of the slides is the opportunity zone set, which is the designation by the governor of census tracts as opportunity zones under the 2017 Federal Tax Reform Act. These are census tracts that have this tax benefit if you invest in them that's now in place. But in order to be an opportunity zone, you had to have a high level of poverty, more than 20% of the population. You had to have an unemployment level that's 2% higher than I think than the states, and the median income of less than 80%. Every census tract in Washington, you can look up on this map, and it tells you that. I can do it from my desk in Forks. However, that was too complicated to do with the strategic locations and the special habitat areas by DNR HQ. So I would argue in the RDIS, in addition to some things Matt's going to show you, that we have a very big problem in the way it looked at rural communities and that dealt with the issue of mitigating those impacts, which is another part of the NEPA analysis. And there's a failure in the strategic area for the OESF. And when you read the economic environmental justice section, it doesn't mention the tribes by name that are impacted that are associated with the strategic area. It doesn't give you a demographic of people of color. It doesn't talk about the low-income communities in the OESF. Something that DNR is familiar with, because nothing else, someone there should have heard, so, well, Rod's been screaming about that for 24 years. So we would argue that's the question. And the final question it doesn't deal with is very bluntly, how are we going to come up with the money that the fire district's going to need? And let's say I'm off by $10,000 a year here, and it's $20,000 to $25,000. They've averaged 50. How are we going to mitigate that impact on the fire district? Then the impact on the hospital district, then the impact on the library. All essential services in Clallam Bay, which is a very, very tiny census tract. I think it's about 1,400 people, of which about 600 or 700 are well contained in the prison. So that's the unanswered questions in this document. So I can answer questions. Hopefully I'm about on time. That's awesome. Just want to go back to my kid on the couch. Yeah.
I'm fire district 5.
My understanding is Fire District 5 has hired a part-time fire chief, and then they have equipment needs, training needs, and operation needs on that equipment and maintenance. In my discussions, brief discussions with folks familiar with the district, they are very used to a budget that's somewhere, I think, in the $75,000 to $95,000 a year level. And that includes putting money aside to buy equipment. Fire districts are unique because in this regard, they're almost always volunteer in rural communities. They might have a paid staffer who's trying to deal with all the requirements. But the big issue on fire districts is training and equipment. If their training or equipment is not at a certain level, they get a grade or a rating, and that rating affects your insurance in those communities. And your insurance, depending where they're rating or they're based on their equipment, either goes up or down. And it's equipment for fire districts is bloody flippin' expensive. We're talking in hundreds of thousands of dollars per unit. A used fire truck can be $750,000 to meet current standards. So pumper trucks, things like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How they would replicate given the fact that thus far DNR has not provided that scale, impact analysis.
For the areas with the strategic locations, I would try to look at the map as quickly as you can. The DNR maps are online. Try to overlay where the strategic location and the special habitat areas are and determine what part of your county's junior taxing districts are associated with those revenues. And if they're in an SHA, presume that around 95% of that is going to be off base. I'm going to give the DNR a 5% wiggle, just that way I don't have to listen to them and say you can't say it's totally off base. Again, point missed. And do that quickly because we have our comments by the 6th of December. I would argue, though, the other thing to make note is that if it's a low-income community, and I'm familiar with the Skagit, Upper Skagit, I'm familiar with Southwest Washington, I would say the odds are in my favor saying that almost all of those will be low-income communities. Ask why DNR failed to meet the executive order requirements to address environmental justice. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, because that question was how could some of the folks looking at these maps replicate the analysis we did? I'm concerned they may not be able to do it like we did it, but you can look at the DNR website with the mapping and look at the issues that I talked about.
So your option B, the blue area would still be
Correct.
But
The yellow would not under this side. Yeah. So the question is under option alternative B, what would and wouldn't be conserved? The green would to some degree, blue obviously would, and then the yellow cream color would not. Yeah, and parts of the couch wouldn't. Yeah. There's some caveats in there, but that's the easiest way to word that. Yes. I think the question is, would I recommend to every junior taxing district that at least in their comments say they would like a formal analysis of the impacts on their taxing district's revenue stream from the DNR's preferred alternative? Yes. Yes. Oh, hell yes.
We also
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yep. And I will say, having done this since '94, that's good to hear in a way. My suspicion is, even though it's going up and down, the patient's heartbeat is getting lower and lower on the graph. And the up and down is somewhat the nature of natural resource revenue, but that the trend is on your graph is a down to the right corner is my suspicion. Yep. Yeah. And the argument is that this will provide certainty and sustainability of revenue and harvest levels to the beneficiaries. The 1997 Habitat Conservation Plan, which I'd note is a fixed point in time for those of you familiar with that phrase, doesn't change. So you have to start from there, I would argue. But what's interesting from that fixed point in time is that we were promised certainty, we were promised stability, and we were promised predictability as a requirement for our accepting. And some of us begrudgingly fought the acceptance of the HCP. So if past practice is an indicator of future performance, I would argue you might want to get the paddles for your patient. Other questions? Fine, thank you.
All right, thank you, Rod. So my apologies to those online. We lost one of our mics just before starting. So we are trying to make sure that we remember to repeat the question as we get started. So take a quick little, I can get this thing to start. All right, I'm going to take a 2-minute break to grab some water myself. Okay, so we'll get started here. We wanted to give a little bit other additional perspective analysis on our views on the marble murrelet strategy. We're going to expand out. Rod did a very good job of kind of zeroing in and using Clallam Bay and the Fire District 5 up in Clallam Bay as a good case study of why this is important. So our goal for today, I'm going to highlight why you need to be engaged in this process and the potential impacts to your organization and community. And I think adding that extra part of community is really important. Real quick background for those of you who have not been eating, sleeping, and breathing this for the last 20 years like Rod. Marble Murrelet Long-Term Conservation Strategy is a product of the 1997 HCP. In 1997, they created an interim strategy that when you read the document, I think it's section 4, starts about page 42 of the HCP. The expectation that was going to be about a 5 to 7 year process. Of course, it's 2018. 2016, we saw a draft EIS release that did not have a preferred alternative. And then in 2018, we had the revised draft EIS released to the public for review. So alternative H is what's being discussed and referred to as the preferred alternative. What it does do is protects all existing long-term forest cover of 567,000 acres, or about 40% of the land base. Creates 29 special habitat areas that are intended to have no human interaction. There is a little bit of disconnect between what's been publicly said, like at the solutions table that Rod referenced, what's in the revised draft EIS, and what's in the actual amendment application document. But the intent is these blocks are going to be large, essentially non-touch areas. It's going to add an additional long-term forest cover, which long-term forest cover is basically areas that will not see variable retention or clear-cut type harvest, so it will always be in a mature state of forest cover. Adds 43,000 acres. That's about 10,000 more than the current interim strategy, or the Alt A, which is kind of the no action alternative. There is potential it's going to impact recreational facilities going forward. I think that's critical to also understand. This is not just about timber volume and revenue to beneficiaries, but also the other services out there on the landscape. And it's our position that they incorrectly apply the P-stage values inconsistently with what the 2008 science team report states, and overstates the amount of habitat on DNR trust lands. And a lot of that is because they rely on the belief that there's what we refer to as legacy trees, or big, large trees that survived the original harvest of the old growth, or sometimes survived the original harvest of the second growth, because some of these stands out on the landscape are third generation stands. That happened depending on who the previous landowner was, and is very site specific. Lots of land did not have legacy trees survive the first or the last harvest process. So what does it not do? As Rod highlighted, doesn't evaluate or disclose the economic impacts to beneficiaries, especially at the junior taxing district level. It does not clearly identify the ability and procedures to manage non-habitat stands with access limitations. So islands, so if you've got a corner that's not protected, but it's surrounded by protected habitat, and I'll use that in air quotes. It's not very clear on that. It looks like you have to have consultation with Fish and Wildlife Service. And I have experience with the lack of desire to have those consultations in various DNR landscapes related to spotted owls. So, and it doesn't address any of the other likely factors impacting the health of marble murrelet populations, beyond nesting habitat, such as what's going on in the oceans, because this is a bird that spends 95% of its life at sea. So what does a murrelet need? Needs a tree large enough and old enough to produce a 7-inch diameter limb, so pretty big, or a platform. They got to be at least about 40 feet off the ground. Bird that flies very fast, very short stubby wings, so it has to do stall landings and drop takeoffs. And it also needs a large canopy above for protection from rain and from predators. That was, as you see there, a very nice tree that I found on the edge of a plantation that helped. Much easier to get that than trying to grab a picture from inside the stand. So it also needs a broken canopy. So this flying at high rates of speed, you need somehow to get into the stand. And so that allows you to access it. These are typical of old growth stands in non-managed forests. And you'll see there in that picture, you'll see it is a smaller hemlock. It's probably about 28 to 32 inches, but it's got mistletoe, and you'll see kind of a platform little area there. Those are kind of the types of things that we're looking for. So special habitat areas, in case you haven't been reading the materials yet, alternatives C and D define them in table S 3.3 of the RDEIS as discrete areas of marbled murrelet habitat and adjacent security forest within which active management and other land uses are restricted. Alternative E and H have a similar description, but the intent is to exclude human interaction influences on these areas, thus reducing revenue to trust beneficiaries now and into the future. Security forest. So the question was, what's the definition of security forest? Security forest is a new definition that came out in the revised draft EIS that is stands that are closed canopy, at least 80 feet tall, that are non-habitat. So the idea is to provide essentially a buffer to the buffer, I guess is the best way to describe it. Inside a special habitat area, yes. So where are they? They're scattered throughout the planning area, but I think Pacific, Wahkiakum, Clallam, and Skagit County are kind of the important ones. Why are we reviewing them? We think ground truthing the P-stage model is critical, and we're finding acres of young non-habitat within the SHAs. One of the early ones that came out is this one in the Browning. When I worked for the department, I burned slash piles within part of that SHA. It kind of put it on my radar pretty quick. So if you see up there, the kind of light purplish polygons, those are mapped as occupied habitat. And the light yellow is mapped as P-stage 0.25. And then the white is all mapped as non-habitat, non-P stage. The interesting thing is, I know this block very well, the large polygon in the bottom, it's pretty much a no-brainer, as you'll see from some of the photos here. Large old stand, likely never logged. The remainder of the units, questionable in my opinion. So we thought about doing a little drone photography, but you're limited to 400 feet above the ground. So Google Earth lets you do these wonderful flyovers. So as we're going here, you'll see we're now headed south to the right. We're about to fly over that big polygon. The red line is kind of our flight path. You can see the texture is much larger canopy. Those big openings that you saw in there were actually blown into the stand in the 07 windstorm. But the important thing is to come back and look inside the amount of non-habitat young plantation. We're just flying over the other occupied polygon in that stand. But you'll see that a large percentage of that SHA is young plantations under about 20, 22 years old. So what does it look like on the ground? Hard to see that lower left corner picture there is looking across Trap Creek. If you know the area to the south, that is looking into that large polygon of occupied and 0.25 habitat. One thing to note, the younger plantation, you'll see that very hard timber edge is actually non-DNR ownership in the middle of the SHA. That is a rock pit, yes. No, actually, yeah, so the question was the kind of the eye in the middle, that is a rock pit. This part of DNR's ownership is very rock poor. In fact, a geologist went out there one time and his response was, you have really hard mud. So that is the geology of the area. There's a lot of volcanic upwelling back in geologic time, and that's a rock pit, and it's very limited resource. And so we believe that that polygon's been cut out, but we haven't gotten clarification yet. Well, that's the other challenge. That rock pit is also on the main haul road that accesses a good portion of that block of timber for DNR that's outside of the SHA. So it's not completely clear. Like I said, the amendment and the RDEIS are a little bit of disconnect. The amendment would imply that keeping those roads open and using that rock pit will be allowed. The RDEIS, I'm not necessarily getting that same message out of it. So Clallam Bay, I won't spend a lot of time on this one, but there's a bigger blow up of the P stage. In the upper, kind of right about where the face is, would be the nose and, you know, the mouth of the kid screaming at his Xbox. I don't know what that's like. It's about 100-acre occupied stand, and the rest of that is a mix of modeled P stage, as well as the white you'll see is mostly young plantations. We'll do just a part flyover of this one, the white one. I tried to shorten these videos so that they wouldn't be quite so long to sit through. And the Browning one worked, but my software to shorten the other two have been a little challenging. So this valley that we're flying over right now was railroad logged. It was pretty much all downhill yarded down to that's Clallam River in the bottom. But you'll see within the purple polygon as we go by that there are portions of younger stands included, some of which I don't think looking at what's on the ground necessarily tracks with what the polygons are for P stage. So far here, everything is, we're coming back around to the, just starting to kind of fly back up the valley there, going into the white area of the shoe, almost, not quite there. That kind of very young opening right below us here is actually mapped as P stage habitat on the map. So now we're looking over the white part of the high tops. And it's important to note as you look at these, the texture of the canopy as we go over, because you can learn a lot about the texture as far as how dense it is, how big the crowns are, really how tall the trees are, if you kind of know what you're looking for. So now we're flying back east down the Clallam River. And we're turning back over, and now we're looking at that first white polygon that's in the middle of the map. Then I will note that when I was out there driving around, this landscape for it was a Monday afternoon at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon gets an amazing amount of foot and recreational traffic. I was dodging pickup trucks of people out hunting and people out just enjoying life on their ATVs and I'm assuming they were looking for the deer and the elk that I never saw, but so we come around, you can see some old legacy roads in there, those linear pieces like right in the lower left corner is an old road that used to access Highway 112. It's now blocked and overgrown. And there we just came back looking. So what does this look like on the ground? As you can see, obviously that upper corner, upper picture is that big clear white spot in the middle of the polygon. What I found were a lot of tall, clean trees, what we refer to as short crowns, so not big, long crowns with lots of live limbs, but short crowns with lots of dead limbs below them, which means as you open up the stand, they don't necessarily, they don't get bigger. Did find in a few spots kind of more of what we were looking for. There's a little bit more mistletoe influence out in these stands, but still pretty dense. A lot of them with not a lot of openings. So radar, now we've moved down into Southwest Washington, again, down in Pacific County. So this is called the Radar Bear South SHA, and what you're looking at right in the very inside that polygon on the right-hand side of the image is an actual occupied stand, and part of that stand is proposed to be transferred through the encumbered lands process. Will be on the board agenda on December 4th. So we're going to do a quick fly through on this one. I think this one's important. Keep in mind, if you really look at the texture of that canopy, so that's kind of what, you know, a known occupied site looks like. And the importance for showing these is to really highlight the amount of young plantations, non-habitat, that's located in these SHAs going forward that will have an impact on beneficiaries. And you'll notice this one on the left, the purple lower right corner of the picture, occupied. The remainder is mostly white, non-habitat, a few small polygons of P stage 0.25. I've walked through part of that yellow polygon right in the middle. I'm still kind of looking for the habitat structures that we would expect to see with that. You can see a lot of younger plantations. One thing to keep in mind, especially in this landscape, hemlock oftentimes doesn't grow to an old age. Just south of here is the Nature Conservancy's Ellsworth Preserve, in which they are doing a lot of actual stand manipulation to enhance marble murrelet habitat. The Solutions Table took a field trip there. Those stands have the big legacy tree structure that you're looking for if you're going to do a habitat enhancement. They've actually been going into some of their stands, commercially thinning them in order to enhance habitat, to accelerate it quicker, to try to add additional habitat to the landscape. We also note on this one, we have a power line that runs right through the middle. So pretty much this polygon, you can see there's been a lot of active management. This landscape, I will also see an additional significant reduction in volume to Pacific County beneficiaries going forward. So, and I don't know why we're just going to jump past this slide because somehow it got in there twice. So what does this one look like on the ground? Once again, lots of young plantations, tall, dense, very what we refer to as clean trees. Even the older stands, you know, when I say older, 70, 80 years old, very short crowns, tall, small limbs. You know, it's important. I actually found a 1947 aerial photo of this area, and the entire area was pretty much logged and burned in 1947. Those little anomalies that you see in the upper left corner of the polygon are lakes. And in the 1947 aerial photo, most of those lakes didn't exist. I think one of them was kind of a swamp. So they're, I think one of them is man-made. I think the rest of them probably just some type of process created them on the landscape. So why does this matter to you? I think we've been talking about it. County roads, fire districts. Just for example, that tender up there in the upper right corner, I believe that was about $475,000, brand new. Built by an outfit down in the southeast part of the United States. Schools, and of course in the lower right corner.
Like the jewel.
Yes.
The best Starbucks library up there. And it was the library paid for by a $100 million donation.
Yeah, so for those of you that are on the online there, that lower right corner is the Timberland Regional Library in Chehalis, and of course the Chehalis Middle School. It's important, you know, impacts the revenue, the beneficiaries, impacts the volume, impact to jobs, you know, and it's the jobs question is a big piece because one thing that's not really being clearly analyzed in the revised draft EIS is while we may see a volume decrease in Pacific County or Wahkiakum County has no mills, we're also not addressing potential impacts to the milling infrastructure in Lewis County that survives off of a lot of volume that flows into it out of Pacific, Cowlitz, Wahkiakum, somewhat Grays Harbor, some of those other counties. So that's important. I think there's also a big question about potential impacts to DNR's economic viability. For those of you who've been digging through or looking at the draft financial analysis for the sustainable harvest calculation that was released as part of the economic analysis, shows a pretty big dip out there. A dip that I question whether or not there's actually enough revenue coming into the department to continue to fund it going forward. And then there are questions about the impacts of the marble murrelet population. You know, what are we, you know, what are those impacts? You know, and it does matter. A lot of these polygons, there's areas in it that, you know, you walk through and it passes the Silly-Grin test to make sense to move forward and protect those areas. But there's also a lot of areas that you see in white that are non-habitat that we're setting aside going forward. So.
Somebody brought up my voice carries enough. Somebody brought up the search or the study that's going on is at Oregon State University. And so how does that play into it? The research that's going on there about that they're noticing, you know, they put collars around 50 or 60 birds, that the birds are for the most part staying out in the ocean, that they're getting most of their food from the ocean. How does that play into all of this?
So what you're referring to is a study being done by Oregon State University. I think we're into year 2. The results have not been fully published yet. of the study. In fact, I'm not sure how many years the study's planned for. But what they did do is radio collar a number of birds. I want to say it's in the 60-ish range. The first year, what they found was a high percentage of those birds never attempted to come into nests. They actually found reportedly one bird up off of Cape Flattery, or Cape Disappointment, up off of the north coast of Washington, and another bird down by Cape Mendocino down in California. So that was kind of, I think, another aha, was these birds are also moving, transitioning up and down the coast, which to me, makes sense. If I want to go to the grocery store to stock up, I go to where the big grocery store is. I don't go to my little mini mart, even though it might be closer. So that's one thing they're finding. The second year studies have also found, I think, similar transitions. They did find, apparently they have a video camera posted on a nest, and it was the first documented predation by a red-tailed hawk. So there's a lot of interesting things that the study's coming out with, but I'm not sure of exactly when that study will be finalized. Yes.
So I was studying the population viability analysis recently, and so it looks at the number of females now versus 50 years from now. And under option H, the preferred alternative, the number of females drops by 69.6%. So it's like, wow, we're doing all of this, and this bird is heading straight down. Well, almost straight down. Option B, the decline was 70.4% over the 50 years. So it's like the difference between option H and option B is very significant to communities and beneficiaries. The difference to the bird, in at least under the PVA, is, I would say, insignificant. In fact, to me, it seems like if we did option B and a much more assertive habitat enhancement program on existing conserved lands, we ought to be able to beat the results of option H. Did I get those numbers right?
I believe so, yes. It's been a little time since I've dug into the population viability analysis. But I think two key takeaways that were highlighted when that first came out and in the most recent updated version is, one thing you have to keep in mind, the values on the axes had to be expanded out significantly in order to actually see the difference between the trend lines of each of the alternatives. When plotted at a normal scale, it was a solid black line because they all overlapped. I think, that's one of the questions to me as a forester, who thinks about how can we manipulate stands, because we do it all the time on, Forest Service ground to try to enhance and accelerate habitat development, is setting these big polygons aside and walking away. Is that the best thing for the marble murrelet? One thing that you'll notice on Rod's big picture was that there were a lot of green squiggles. Those all were riparian areas. One thing we've heard repeatedly about riparian areas is that they don't provide quality habitat for marble murrelets. Yet I can go through and find lots of riparian areas that are mapped as occupied murrelet sites. So I think you are on, I think, an interesting path that's not been explored, is the fact that all of these alternatives essentially have very little significant change in the ultimate outcome. So what really is out there that we could be doing to find a better outcome and solution for both the marble murrelet and for the beneficiaries and for the industry that survives off of the volume from that program. And
given the uncertainty about all of this, uncertainty about what's really affecting the bird and all that kind of stuff, and we don't know a lot about recovery, to me it seems like we ought to, and there may be other problems with this, but the adaptive management plan concept to me makes a lot of sense. So we say, let's go with option B in terms of the set aside of land, but then let's try various things and measure the results and see if we can't learn from this. The analogy that I used when at the solution table was long ago, the feds created a program called CREP, Conservation Riparian Easement Program, and basically paid farmers to reestablish wild grasses and the native plants that improve the water quality. And they very quickly figured out how to do that. They figured out how to actually grow the seed. They figured out you have to burn it every 5 years, things like that. So to me, it seems like charging a group of people to figure out how to reverse that downward trend or improve it, at least improve the results compared to 69 to 70%, makes a whole lot of sense.
And I would concur, and I think that that's important. One argument that I think that we would hear that I've heard before is that because the marble murrelet has site fidelity to its nesting grounds, that going out and trying to enhance these areas that's not currently using. Now, of course, that contradicts the idea of growing more habitat, which I'm also trained as an engineer first, and so for me, 2 + 2 always equals 4. So trying to rationalize this, walking away is better than doing enhancement for a bird that always comes back to the same place, but we don't know if it's a challenging conversation for me to try to rationalize out. But to me, it seems like it makes sense. The other argument that we've heard is that because of that site fidelity, it's not like the northern spotted owl, where you can go out and create more habitat and move habitat around the landscape because the owls will move to where that new habitat's at. Of course, I would argue that we're not sure how that's really played out either, because they forgot to take into account this thing called the barred owl. So that the population viability analysis, if you look at it, there's the risk assessment and the enhancement assessment. The enhancement was just changing the variable of the success of reproduction, but it doesn't address what might need to be done to change that variable. The assumption is more habitat, more condos, but if you don't have more Safeways, what good are the more condos? And so I think that's where I really think this whole process tends to fall down in this analysis. So I'm going to, let me check really quick, make sure there's no questions. If there's any questions from the group, and then I'm going to turn it over to Heath for kind of finishing things up on kind of what's the next. So there are no questions been sent via text and none sent via email. So
yeah, if I can, I have one question. Since we're talking about populations, most of the time that I looked at the different papers that were referring to the population surveys that have been done since the HCP was put in place. Well, first of all, the first discussion in 1993 was that they thought there was about 5,000 birds in the state of Washington. When the HCP, the first discussion about population of murrelets in Washington said approximately 5,500 birds. Then we went out and started trying to find them. In the first year, you probably remember that in Washington, in the 2 zones, it was over 10,000 birds. And then it went up from there a little bit until it started going down. And it says in the reports that we're at a 3.9% decline per year. Also, in other places, it says like 4.4%, but I'm not sure exactly which one they're working with. But if you look at it on a bird basis per year, it goes up and down kind of the same way as the revenues for the junior taxing districts. And it's on a downward facing scale, but up and down, up and down. And oh, by the way, just recently, and I think it was 2011-12, they actually were up pretty good, 7 to 10,000 birds again in Washington. Now, if you look at the way that they survey for the birds, I can understand it. I mean, they're on boats and they're trying to find them on a cross section out in the open waters, and I certainly can understand how you can or can't find the birds. But my question is, we always talk about density of birds on the water when we're talking about how it's declining. We don't ever talk about what the real number of birds are, and that whole thing of, certainly if we think to start with we didn't have any birds, but we went out and looked, we have them, then we're going to be declining right from the get-go. So I don't know if that, I mean, I certainly can understand, since it's an ESA issue, that we have a bird with a declining population. It just seems to me that it is so variable, it's hard to make sure that the only thing that we will know for sure is we're going to reduce the revenues to the different trust beneficiaries.
Yeah, I think, you know, if you look at the monitoring reports for the Northwest Forest Plan, where they do the monitoring and the at-sea surveys, you know, one thing to note is the confidence intervals for all of those overlap. So, you know, statistically that starts to create some problems with, in my mind, of actually trying to identify true trends. And you're right, we are controlling for one variable, potential suitable high quality nesting habitat, without looking at the myriad of other variables that could be influencing those changes that you're seeing in those assessments, which is, you know, birds moving, the changes in forage conditions in the ocean, you know, some changes, you know, on uplands. So it's a real variable thing, but you're right. The one thing we do know is we're setting more land aside, which will reduce revenues to beneficiaries going forward. So Heath?
All right, thank you. I'm going to, well, you had, you know, I think a good run through of some important disciplines like economics and law and engineering and forestry. I practice in political science too much, unfortunately. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're at kind of politically on this issue, how it's been brought into the legislature over the last year or so. There has been a lot of interest in the long-term conservation strategy. So on October 30th, 2017, DNR received a letter from 12 legislators essentially in support of Alternative B, essentially making the case that the plan with the least possible impact to the beneficiaries should be something that DNR looks to move forward with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That was a cross-section of legislators from across the state, but certainly heavier to the districts that would be most impacted, including the 19th district in Southwest Washington, the 24th district on the Olympic Peninsula, and the Lewis County, so forth, a lot of those legislators. On November 17th, 2017, the House Agriculture and Natural Resources Committee convened a work session, sort of a hearing on the long-term conservation strategy, and DNR came up and presented on the long-term conservation strategy, and then several there were beneficiary representatives there as well that kind of provided their perspective. During the 2018 legislative session, I joke sometimes that it was a very marbled, murrelet-focused session, surprisingly, a small bird. We had 2 bills specifically introduced related to the long-term conservation strategy. One, House Bill 2285, which was primed by Representative Chapman, and the other one, House Bill 2300, which was sponsored by Representative Walsh. Both received about, and cumulatively probably were in front of legislative committees 6 or 7 times as they worked their way through the process. Of course, we'll talk a little bit about House Bill 2285. That was the bill that was actually enacted into law this last session. But, the opportunity that we had was we were in front of committees that you're not always in front of on an issue like this. We were in front of the Capital Budget Committee. We were in front of Economic Development Committees. So it was Ways and Means Committee. We were outside of the normal kind of ag and natural resources, which I think was a great opportunity to work with legislators who might not be incredibly familiar with the Marble Murrelet or this issue, or DNR timber for that matter. On February 12th, there was about an hour-and-a-half debate on the House floor on the House passage of House Bill 2285. I guess I'd underscore the rarity of that happening on any natural resource issue, let alone one as, minute as a long-term conservation strategy for the Marbled Murrelet. But if you watched that debate, it was there were a lot of legislators who could understand this issue, and not only it did boil down into a little bit of a traditional debate about setting aside habitat for species and versus humans, which is bound to happen. But I think there was a heavy focus here on we need to know what the impact of this plan is, and we need to be able to have, be able to benchmark that and compare it to, which I think was useful, and I think will play into things as we move forward. As we move through the session, we're working with legislators to try to figure out what's the role for the legislature to play here. I mean, ultimately, DNR is the land manager. They are out negotiating this with the Fish and Wildlife Service, but what is the role the legislature has to play? We did have an amendment that was attached to the Senate version of the supplemental operating budget, which would have required DNR to submit Alternative B to the Fish and Wildlife Service, along with any preferred alternative that the department, selected. That language was opposed by DNR, so it ultimately didn't move forward. What did was the language here you can see on the screen, which was heavily negotiated, which is Latin for like milquetoast, as I like to call it at times here, language that ended up in the supplemental operating budget, which in my view simply reaffirmed DNR's fiduciary obligation. As one of the people involved in this language, I can tell you even the suggestion of adding in there that there shouldn't be set-asides above and beyond the legal requirements of the ESA and the HCP was something that DNR had concerns with. So this language ended up being, rather negotiated, but I think it was important because the legislature here clearly signaled its concern that any long-term conservation strategy, not exceed what the DNR's obligation is under the Endangered Species Act. So I think it sets us up very nicely heading into the next session. We talked a little bit about House Bill 2285. That bill was adopted. It requires a losses and gains report annually to be submitted to the legislature on either the preferred alternative or as we move forward, whatever alternative is being considered by the Fish and Wildlife Service until one is eventually adopted. It requires recommendations to the legislature to mitigate the impact of those losses and gains. And then it calls for annual committee work sessions on that information to be provided. So I think Rod and Matt did a pretty good job talking about the concerns with the initial economic analysis, this losses and gains report that was provided, how it really looked at counties as a whole, and it really masks over some of the more localized impacts. The other thing that happened here, I think Rod did a good job of putting up the chart showing no matter how you look at this, we're losing net acres in terms of what's going to be managed. I think any common person would go, well, we understand there's going to be a reduction in revenue. We get it. Just, doctor, tell me what I need to know and I'll try to deal with it. What this, the initial losses and gains report did was paint a pretty rosy picture in decade one by, I don't know exactly why, but the way the harvest was scheduled, that you'd look at it and you'd go, wow, you take 10,000 acres offline and actually we're going to go up in revenue in a lot of these places. The report noted that there would be reductions in future decades, but it did not provide information on what those would be. So I think when the legislature comes in back in 2019, I think this is going to be a significant issue, which is what are the true impacts of this plan going to be? And those of you who are junior taxing districts, I think your voices are going to be really important to make it known that we need any losses and gains report to consider what the impacts are at that kind of a localized level, because right now that is not being done, and we've already talked about that. That's what I see moving forward there. The other piece that is still hanging out there is back from 2012, the Encumbered Land Steering Committee, which was set up by House Bill 2329 back then. Those meetings have continued. That effort was focused primarily on Pacific, Wahkiakum, and Skamania counties, where due to the way the interim strategy had laid on those counties and the way that the spotted owl conservation had laid down on Skamania County, was trying to come up with options for mitigating the impacts there. And so that report is set to come to the legislature in December, and we very well might see some very large trust land transfer proposals to try to swap land bases around, which is never easy to do, and it affects certain beneficiaries as you try to move common school trusts to then be county trust lands and so forth. So a lot to play out there. This has also gotten some congressional attention. Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler, who represents Southwest Washington, has written multiple letters to the Fish and Wildlife Service and DNR, Board of Natural Resources, on expressing her concern with the long-term conservation strategy, in particular the impacts to Southwest Washington. She also offered an amendment that was included in the House version of the fiscal year 2019 Interior Appropriations Bill that essentially prohibited Fish and Wildlife Service from considering or adopting any long-term conservation strategy that sets aside lands in excess of those identified as occupied habitat, existing old growth stands that will become old growth within the next 70 years, and associated buffers. So it gets to this very issue that I think we've talked about a lot with the kinds of younger forests that are getting swept up in some of the SHAs, and questioning whether what the benefit of those is going to be. If you haven't figured this out, Congress is not exactly functional, so I don't expect this language to make it into a final appropriations bill for the interior agencies, which are currently running under something we call a continuing resolution and haven't had their final appropriations bills adopted. But I don't see this language ultimately being included, but I think it's a sign of the interest that's there. Finally, I think it's kind of our wrap-up screen. You're here, you care, thank you. Those of you on line, thank you. Kind of what can you do? I think that's what a lot of people want to know, and that's what we want to try to encourage. So, of course, comments, they're due on December 6th. We were successful in getting a 30-day extension of that comment period, I think, which was really, really important to provide more time for the kinds of analysis that have occurred to take place. At the back of the table, as well as Matt emailed out before this event, a couple documents that we think might be helpful to you. One is kind of a one-page backgrounder on the Marble Murrelet long-term conservation strategy process, what's at stake, so forth. So you can get that in the back. There also are some key points that you could include in your comments. That I think some of the things that we have gone over today that I think is important to get into your comments. I'd say when we talked about this, a continued focus on the economic and revenue analysis with DNR and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and specifically requesting that DNR provide an impact analysis specific to your public entity, whether you're a junior taxing district or a county or other entities that's critical. I think engagement with the Board of Natural Resources is really important. That is the body that will ultimately make a decision. Both when Fish and Wildlife Service comes back with something, that is the body that is charged with determining whether it's in the best interests of the trust to select a long-term conservation strategy. So I think engagement with those board members, who most of them are there representing beneficiaries. So, coming at it from that angle is really important. I do expect this issue to, again, get attention in the 2019 legislative session. If we're looking to mitigate impacts to beneficiaries, including junior taxing districts, if we don't get that information, I think the legislature is going to get pretty concerned about that, and they are going to want DNR to provide that information, because I don't know how they can set up a program to mitigate impacts without knowing what those impacts are. So I would expect that will be a focus here. And then finally, I guess it's just kind of keeping in up to date in what's going on. We've tried to do that through the Washington Community Schools Network. Also Healthy Forests, Healthy Communities, which is kind of a grassroots, earned media effort, advocacy effort, is involved in trying to generate kind of grassroots comments on this plan. Because we know, frankly, that the environmental community will do that on the opposite side, just pouring in hundreds, if not thousands, of comments about just protect the more habitat, that'll help the bird, kind of as simple as that. And I think what we're trying to do is get more information out. So that's kind of what you can do. And I guess I'd say this is always evolving. Today, a decision came out of the Supreme Court, United States Supreme Court, I think that could be impactful moving forward on endangered species. It had to do with the designation of critical habitat for an owl in the south, or a frog in the south. And the Supreme Court unanimously ruled, expressing some real concerns about the designation of unoccupied habitat that couldn't be occupied under critical habitat. Now, critical habitat is a different process than an HCP, but I still think there's a lot evolving in this area that could change. So that's kind of what I had. Matt or Rod, are there any other questions or comments? Okay.
Then there's a question about legislation. If you know, or if anyone knows, if there'll be an effort to memorialize in legislation of the legislature being the trustee of the estate.
I'm not sure, but I know there are some interested legislators who are, looking for what they can do. So I how that would look is, I think, a question mark, but there are some legislators in key positions, committee chairs, who are very concerned about the impact of this plan and want to make sure that we get it right as a state, that we do right by the communities, that we do right by the species, which I think is everyone's goal. And I think those legislators are looking for alternatives. So honestly, if you have ideas, number one, go to your legislators and tell them you're concerned. Number two, if you do have ideas, go to them as well. You'd be surprised how many things start out with constituent concerns and comments in terms of bills moving forward. Got
You may have said this, but I don't know if I remember that you did, but can you give us an idea what the solutions table timeline is now?
And actually I might let Matt answer that, because I think Matt or Rod, some of these other folks may know that better at this point, or Brian, do you want to do it?
Yeah, I thought I was signing up for a 1-year stint, but it's longer than that. I represent the School Directors Association on the solutions table. I think and to be, it is both the solutions table that was envisioned by the commissioner as a way to try to explore some ideas that are beneficial to the beneficiaries, to the bird, and to the communities. But it is also the advisory committee under House Bill 2285. That's the one that carries forward longer than what I thought it was going to be. But so far, I think the tone of the group is still working together. I'm still skeptical a bit about what we might be able to achieve, but at least I've been able to tee up this idea that habitat enhancement on existing conservation land is an important thing to explore. At the last in-person meeting, we spent quite a bit of time on that. There was a federal fish and wildlife guy there who's been working on the TNC, what's the name of that? Ellsworth property. And he talked about okay, you build some really cool nesting sites for this bird, you're going to have to somehow recruit the bird to come there. I envisioned that if habitat was the limiting factor, you'd have a bunch of birds with a big egg in them, with their legs crossed, holding it in, flying around looking for a site to land in. But apparently that's not the case. But I think that's part of the unknown. Well, if we develop some premium nesting sites along the path that birds are already taking to existing nesting sites, maybe they'll take the closest one. I don't know. So there's that spirit of exploring creative ideas that I think is positive for the solutions table. But there's just some fundamentally different interests among the parties.
I do think one of the challenges with the solutions table is that in the RDIS, it's referred to as a potential site source to deal with mitigation issues. Yet, to date, I'm not convinced the solution table has been given all the depth of the problem to figure out what they're mitigating. And efforts to try to point that out by a few of us in the audience, I would say, have not been well received by others.
I'll answer from back here so we don't get any microphones, dueling microphones. I'd say I'd second that of sitting in the audience. My perception is that the group is still, you bring any group together that has very diverse opinions, positions are coming from, it takes a very long time to build trust and move that group forward. They've had, four in-person meetings starting back in about June or so. So I think they're still very early in just the building the group dynamic still. I don't sense that they've really characterized and framed what the problem is they're solving for. A lot of that I think is due to because a lot of this data is lacking about economic impacts, especially to finite areas and finite taxing districts, and what that looks like. So I'm optimistic that it'll play out. I don't think that the timelines of House Bill 2285 or the timelines that Brian thought he was signing up for in the other vision for the group, I think are probably are unrealistic to come up with a substantive and useful solution or group of solutions moving forward.
I think one of the things that I did hear that I think is, insightful in the whole thing was that some of the environmental representatives very much didn't understand why, there wouldn't be some sort of thinning in some of these intermediate, what I'll call intermediate age stands to try to accelerate them into have more old growth characteristics, and finding out that these SHAs are completely no touch, not only to forestry, but, other activities, I think was, a pretty stark realization for some of them, but it really does, as we move forward in this process and we see these SHAs, this idea of security forests, if you wanted to take that as far as you could call, the need for security forests being hundreds of miles around an occupied site. And at some point, you've got to get to some ability to focus on producing additional old growth habitat, and then figuring out what is really needed in terms of buffers. So I guess, Matt, I'll turn it over to you to close us and see if there's any other questions that have come in.
Okay, so to kind of wrap up, I've not gotten any other questions in remotely. So I think there's another point there that I was going to follow up on from what Heath was saying, but the one pager I think is a good start for your organizations in framing your comments. I think it's very important to get as many of the beneficiaries engaged. We are slowly growing our numbers of those engaged, but if any of you know of others who have not become engaged, I would encourage you to reach out to them. Rod, I'm going to put him out there, myself, Heath. We've got a pretty deep team at AFRC that are more than happy to assist you if you have questions as you're developing your comments going forward. Like I said, when it gets to the point that both Rod and I can quote pages and we see questions pop up, and we're running through the Rolodex visually in our heads of which page it is in the HCP or which chart it was that we saw 4 years ago in a document produced. You have resources there to help you craft those going forward. And I think the key thing that's unique to your organizations is highlighting the benefits that you guys provide from these revenues and what you will not be able to provide by losing those revenues. Having served in a rural fire district that was actually very healthy financially, at times there are financial burdens on a fire district, a volunteer fire department. If your EMS, emergency medical services program, is provided by the local fire district, guess what? They have to pay for all the EpiPens that they have to carry on their apparatus. Those get changed out every year. They get expensive. Keeping up to date on breathing apparatus, keeping up to date on modern fire equipment, it's expensive. Keeping up to date and keeping, relative in the modern world of technology for libraries is expensive. And so highlighting those things going forward, I think, is critical as you think about developing your comments. AFRC, of course, being tied heavily to foresters, a lot of our comments will be pretty detailed about forestry, but I think, the highlighted part is the failure in SEPA and NEPA to adequately look at the economic impacts to rural communities throughout Western Washington, and what that means going forward, I think needs to be, highlighted, and the beneficiaries need to make sure that you stand up and make your voices heard. And Heath is right. Talk to your legislators. Ultimately, the legislature is the trustee of these lands. DNR is the land manager. And so, engage them. But there are a lot of very interested legislators throughout Western Washington in this process. I can tell you that the impacts that we're seeing through the Encumbered Land Steering Committee that I serve on, really, when you start digging into just doing even simple back of the napkin calculations of the economic impacts and the loss of revenue, we're not talking tens of thousands of dollars, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars by the time this all adds up. And at some point back in that work session that Heath highlighted back a couple slides back, let's see if I can go back. At November 17th, 2017 work session, there was a question put to DNR who was going to pay for that economic revenue impact? And DNR did not answer the question. So with that, thank you. If you have questions, I can send out, I can turn these presentations into PDFs and send them out. And we have the handouts. Like I said, if you have questions, you have my contact information, email, phone, text. I am more than willing, though limited time-wise, to more than happy to jump on the phone, and we'll fit in-person visits in your local localities if we can make those arrangements happen. So any further questions? Yes, I will. And the other thing is, now this is the first time we've used this venue, we've used this format. We're supposed to be getting a recorded version. So we're hoping to be able to share that. I know Tuesdays, middle of the day are rough for some county commissioners because they have commissioner meetings. I know a couple of them are having budget meetings today. And so we're hoping to be able to share this with them between now and December 6th, because they were unable to attend because of their commission meetings. So.
By the way, I wanted to let you know that preview we have a lot, right? Better.
Okay, with that, we'll adjourn. Thank you.